When Harry White first saw the house on the outskirts of a small town in Indiana, he couldn't help but smile. It was a classic American cottage, built in the early 1950s. With a slanted roof and peeling blue paint, the two-story house looked like an artifact of a bygone era. The realtor had talked enthusiastically about the potential of the building, but even he couldn't hide the obvious. The house needed major repairs. Harry had bought it for next to nothing, using the last of his savings from a divorce. At 45, he decided it was time to start over, and this house seemed like the perfect project. His job as an electrician allowed him to handle technical tasks, and the idea of fixing up the house himself gave him a sense of purpose. The first weeks after moving in were difficult. The house was cold and damp, with a rotten kitchen floor and creaking stairs. Wires were sticking out of the walls, and the water pipes looked more like museum exhibits. Harry started with small things. He replaced switches, repaired pipes, filled the deepest cracks in the walls. Despite his fatigue, he found satisfaction in this process. Every nail he hammered and every wall he repainted brought the house closer to the state he dreamed of seeing. One evening, sorting through old boxes left by the previous owners in the attic, Harry found several yellowed photographs. They captured moments from the life of the family who once lived here. Children playing in the backyard, a man working in a workshop, a woman cooking on an old stove. These images brought the house to life in his imagination, filling it with warmth and history. However, after a month, more serious tests began. During one of the thunderstorms, a large leak appeared in the kitchen. The ceiling literally began to cry. Harry had to immediately turn off the power and use a stepladder to climb up to the roof to install a temporary patch. By the next morning, he was working on replacing the entire roof. After that, Harry decided that the next stage of the renovation should be the living room. It was the largest room in the house, and it was here that he planned to spend his evenings relaxing by the fireplace, which he was going to restore. The living room seemed the most promising. It had old but sturdy wooden flooring, large windows, and a carved ceiling cornice. However, the walls were covered in peeling paneling, and the plaster crumbled with every awkward movement. The work on the living room took almost 3 weeks. Harry worked almost without days off, removing old paneling, straightening the walls, and renewing the floor. Sometimes he noticed oddities. The rooms in this house did not always correspond to typical sizes. For example, the walls seemed a little thicker than expected. But Harry did not pay attention to this, attributing everything to the peculiarities of the old structure. Meanwhile, he was increasingly imbued with the atmosphere of the house. In the evenings, when the daylight faded, he turned on a small portable lantern, sat on the ladder, and looked at his work. Although the house still required a lot of effort, the progress was obvious. He felt proud that step by step he was turning the ruin into a cozy home. One day, removing old boards from a dismantled wall in the living room, Harry found something unusual. Among a layer of dust and cobwebs lay a small metal object. It was an old door handle, clearly taken from some piece of furniture. Harry thought about it, but quickly discarded it as another piece of trash left by the previous owners. In the evenings, he felt more and more lonely. After the divorce, it seemed to him that life had lost its color. His ex-wife, Linda, had long ago settled down in another state, and his son, who had recently turned 17, answered his calls less and less. The house had become for Harry not only a project, but also a way to fill the void. But one day, everything changed. It was a cold January evening. Harry had just finished another stage of redecorating the living room and noticed an oddity that had previously escaped his attention. He was checking the dimensions of the room to order wallpaper, and suddenly realized that the length of the outer wall of the house did not match the length of the inner wall. This discovery puzzled him, but there was no explanation. Harry simply shrugged and decided to leave it for later. But the thought of the discrepancy did not give him peace. He began to notice small things. Corners that seemed too deep, an odd feeling of emptiness when he knocked on certain sections of the wall. Harry began to wonder, what if there was something hidden inside the walls that he hadn't noticed before? Ever since he discovered the discrepancy in the measurements, Harry couldn't stop thinking about it. In the morning, he went to the local hardware store, bought a new laser rangefinder and tape measure, and in the evening, he began to take more careful measurements. The wall in the living room, facing the backyard, was definitely thicker than it should have been. Harry tried to explain it logically. Maybe they had simply left an extra layer of insulation behind the paneling, or the old structure required such measures. But even these excuses seemed far-fetched to him. In the following days, he tried to focus on other things. He needed to finish the kitchen, sort out the trash in the yard, and reinforce the stairs, which had begun to wobble dangerously. But the strange discovery did not let go. At some point, Harry realized that he was overcome not by simple curiosity, but by a strange, almost obsessive desire to find out what was hidden behind the wall. A week later, he finally decided to do it. He took a few days off work at a morning meeting, citing renovations, and returned home armed with tools. He started by removing the new trim he'd installed a couple of weeks earlier. Underneath was old wood, and underneath that, a layer of plaster. Harry worked carefully, so as not to destroy everything around him, but with each layer he peeled away, his tension grew. When he reached the inner layer of the wall, he felt a slight vibration under his feet. It was strange, like a faint humming sound coming from deep within the house. Harry paused, trying to listen, but after a few seconds, it went silent. He decided to ignore it and continued. Using a hammer, he made a small hole in the wall. Dust billowed into the air, causing him to cough. When visibility improved, Harry shone the flashlight into the hole. Behind the layer of plaster, a void was revealed. But it was not the simple void between the walls that he had expected to see. Behind the wooden planks was a small space that was clearly a compartment or hiding place. Harry widened the hole so that he could look inside. The space was about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. At first glance, it appeared to be empty, but in the far corner, something glinted. He reached out, feeling his heart beat faster. What he pulled out was an old metal box. It was covered in a layer of dust and rust, but the hinges still looked strong. Harry pushed the lid open with difficulty. Inside was a small wad of money, wrapped in thin, almost crumbling paper. The notes looked old, judging by the style. They could have been issued in the middle of the last century. But the money was not the only find. At the bottom of the box was a note. Harry unfolded the yellowed sheet of paper and began to read. The text was handwritten. The ink faded in places. It read, "If you have found this, then you are in the right place at the right time. This is just the beginning. You will find more. Trust your intuition and follow the signs. And remember, this must not fall into the wrong hands." Harry stared at the note, trying to understand its meaning. He reread it several times, but none of the interpretations seemed convincing enough. Who could have left such a message? And what did these words mean? In the following hours, Harry almost completely abandoned other matters. He searched the hiding place up and down, trying to find something else, but the space turned out to be empty. The box and the note were the only finds. However, the thought that something else could be hidden behind the walls of the house now did not give him peace. Later in the evening, he tried to find information about the previous owners of the house. In the city archives, he learned that the house had belonged to the same family for 50 years. The first owner was a man named Edward Hoffman, a mechanic who, apparently, built the house with his own hands. After his death, the house passed to his son, and then was sold to other people. But none of the records mentioned anything strange or unusual. The next day, Harry decided to search the attic. He remembered the old photographs he had found in the box earlier. Maybe they contained some clues? Leafing through the pictures, he noticed one detail that had previously escaped his attention. In several of the photographs, Edward Hoffman was posing next to the house, and behind him on the wall were strange marks resembling symbols carved into the surface. This discovery brought back that feeling of being closer to a solution. He couldn't explain why, but now it seemed as if the entire history of the house was more than just another renovation project. That night, he couldn't sleep for a long time. Questions swirled in his head. Why did Hoffman leave a note? What was he trying to hide? And was there really more to this house than just a stash of money? When Harry finally fell asleep, his sleep was restless, filled with images of strange symbols and empty hallways. He woke up at dawn with the clear understanding that to find out the truth, he had to keep looking. The house hadn't given up all its secrets yet. The morning began with a thick fog that covered the streets, as if hiding Harry's house from the rest of the world. He sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window, but thoughts about the note and the photographs he had found did not leave him for a second. What did the symbols on the wall mean? Why did the previous owner leave such a message? These questions pushed him forward like an invisible force. Harry decided to start with the attic, which he had long wanted to dismantle. He had gone up there several times, but had never spent enough time on a detailed inspection. This time he was prepared. He took a powerful flashlight, a dust mask, and gloves with him. The attic was as chaotic as the rest of the house before the renovation began. Old boxes, tools, disassembled furniture, and piles of newspapers dating back to the 1960s lay everywhere. He began to methodically sort through the boxes. Most of them contained the usual junk: tattered books, children's toys, tools that had long since stopped working. But among all this, Harry came across a small leather album. Opening it, he saw old notes written in the same handwriting as the note from the hiding place. The pages were filled with diagrams and brief notes, which Harry understood almost nothing. On one of the pages, he noticed something strange: a schematic drawing of a house. The drawing showed a living room, and next to it a small arrow pointing in the direction where there was no room or other rooms. This spot coincided with the very wall where he had found the hiding place. Following logic, Harry decided to check the rest of the house. He walked through the rooms with a tape measure, measuring the length of the walls and comparing the results with the external dimensions of the house. His suspicions were confirmed. The living room wall was not the only anomaly. In the basement, he noticed a strange protrusion, which, apparently, had no logical explanation. The basement had long been abandoned. The stairs creaked underfoot, and the smell of damp and mold grew stronger with every step. There were traces of stains on the walls, and someone had left a rusty shelving unit in one of the corners. Harry walked around the room, examining every detail. In the center of one of the walls, he noticed a small metal hook embedded in the stonework. Intuitively, Harry pulled the hook. At first, nothing happened, but then he felt how the mechanism hidden inside the wall gave way slightly. There was a barely audible grinding sound, and a narrow gap appeared in the stonework. Harry's heart began to beat faster. He went back upstairs for tools and returned with a crowbar and a lantern. Using the crowbar, he carefully widened the gap, opening a passage. Behind the wall was a small corridor, about 3 feet wide, leading somewhere deep into the house. Harry pointed the lantern forward and, gathering his courage, stepped inside. The corridor was narrow and dark, with uneven brick walls that were clearly built by hand. The air here was musty, and the floor seemed damp with moisture. After walking about 10 steps, Harry saw that the corridor widened, turning into a small room. There were some objects scattered on the floor: empty bottles, pieces of paper, broken tools. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest. Harry crouched down next to the chest and examined it. The hinges looked strong, but the wood was darkened with age. With difficulty, he opened the lid, expecting to see something unusual. However, inside the chest there were only a few items: another note, a small leather pouch, and old maps. The note was as laconic as the first: "You are on the right path. Follow the symbols. Remember, it is your choice to take what you find or to leave everything as it is. Whoever finds the end of the path must be prepared to face the consequences." Harry frowned, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiety building. He picked up the leather pouch and opened it. Inside were several gold coins. They looked old, but their weight and shine suggested that they were real gold. The maps from the chest turned out to be old maps of the area, with strange marks on them. One of them was right where Harry's house was. He decided to take the finds with him and went back upstairs, carefully sealing the passage in the basement. He spent the rest of the day studying the maps and photographs, trying to find a connection between them. On one of the maps, he noticed a mark not far from the house, which coincided with an area in the backyard. The next day, armed with a shovel, Harry headed to the backyard. There was a small old tree there, which he had originally intended to cut down, but never got around to it. The mark on the map pointed right to its base. Harry began digging around the tree, and soon his efforts bore fruit. Under the earth, he found a metal box, much larger than the one in the wall. The box was heavy and rusty. Harry carried it into the house, where he had difficulty opening the lid. Inside, he found several bundles of money wrapped in rags that looked much newer than the ones he had found in the wall. However, among the money, there was another object that caught his attention. It was an old photograph of Edward Hoffman, taken in front of the house. But now Harry noticed another detail. Hoffman was holding an object that resembled a key. The key was not in the box. Harry suddenly realized that what he had found was far from everything. The note had warned of consequences, which meant that there was much more to come than a chest of coins. Harry felt like the main character in an old detective novel. His house, which had seemed like just another renovation project, was gradually turning into a real mystery. The box of money he found, the notes, the maps, all of this had become part of some game, the rules of which he didn't yet understand. The only thing he knew for sure was that the key Edward Hoffman was holding in the photograph was an important part of the solution. He looked at the picture several times, trying to figure out where the key could be. The house had been searched through, but he couldn't see the key anywhere. It soon occurred to Harry that he might have missed something obvious. Deciding it would be best to start from the beginning, he returned to the basement where the chain of events had begun. This time he examined the room much more carefully. His gaze slid over every crack, every unevenness. The metal hook that had opened the secret passage caught his attention. Harry felt the wall around it, checking for any other hidden mechanisms. But he couldn't find anything else. Then he decided to turn to the maps he had found in the chest. One of them, dated to the beginning of the 20th century, looked like an old plan of the surrounding area. Several places were marked on it, which clearly didn't match up with modern buildings. One of them caught Harry's attention, a plot of land in the woods, just a mile from his house. In the center of the mark was the word gatehouse. He remembered that not far from the house there really was a dense forest. Locals said that there used to be a line of old hunting routes here, but now these paths have long been overgrown. Harry decided that it was time to check where this new clue led. Armed with a map, a flashlight, and a small backpack with tools, he set off. The frosty morning made the air prickly, but the clear sky promised a good day. Making his way through the bushes and tall grass, Harry walked towards the point on the map. Along the way, he kept looking back, feeling a strange tension. It seemed to him that someone was watching him, although he knew for sure that there could be no one in the forest. After half an hour of walking, he noticed what he was looking for. Among the trees covered in moss, there was an old wooden hut. It looked abandoned. The roof had collapsed in several places, the windows were boarded up, and the door was wrapped with a rusty chain with a massive lock. Harry walked closer, examining the hut. Its appearance confirmed that it had been abandoned for a long time, but the chain on the door was relatively new. Someone had clearly been trying to maintain access to this place. He looked around the area and found traces of an old fire covered in snow. Apparently, someone had been here quite recently. Harry felt that feeling again, a mixture of excitement and anxiety that had accompanied him all this time. The lock on the door looked strong, but Harry always carried a small set of tools with him. After a few minutes of hard work, he managed to open the chain. The inside of the hut was cold and dark. The beam of the flashlight picked out the dilapidated walls, broken chairs, and an old table. On the wall hung a shelf, covered with some jars and tools. At first glance, there was nothing unusual in the hut, but Harry noticed that the floorboards in the center of the room looked different from the rest. He knelt down and ran his hand along the surface. The boards creaked slightly when he pressed on them. It felt like there was empty space underneath. Harry took off his gloves to get a better feel for every detail. His fingers found a small indentation that turned out to be a lock. It was an unusual lock, obviously handmade. Harry realized that this was where the key from the photo fit. But he didn't have the key. He looked around the hut again, hoping to find some kind of clue. On the shelf, he noticed an old toolbox. Among the rusty screwdrivers and wrenches, there was a wooden box. Harry opened it, and his heart sank. Inside was the same key, an exact copy of the one in the photo. Harry took the key and returned to the lock on the floor. At first, he thought the mechanism was rusty, but after several tries, the key finally turned. The boards gave way, opening a passage into a narrow stone passage. Having descended, Harry found himself in a small underground room. The room was empty except for one thing. In the center stood a wooden chest, massive and menacing. Harry walked up to it and lifted the lid. What he saw shocked him. The chest was full of money. Old bills dating back to the 1930s and 1940s were neatly stacked. It was a mountain of cash. But there were other things among the money. Stacks of documents, antique jewelry, and several journals with notes. Harry picked up one of the journals and began to read. It was Edward Hoffman's diary. The entries detailed how he hid money to avoid the authorities. Hoffman had been involved in a bank robbery that had taken place in 1947. The entries detailed how he laundered the money and hid it in hiding places, including this house and the cabin. But on the last pages of the journal, Harry came across a grim warning. If you are reading this, then you have found my hiding places. This money is not a gift. It is cursed, like me. Anyone who touches it will suffer misfortune. You may take it, but think twice before you do so. Sometimes the truth is more valuable than gold. Harry lowered the journal and looked at the chest. Now he knew the truth, but what to do with it? Harry stood in the dungeon, thinking about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. In front of him lay a chest filled with money, jewelry, and documents that, according to the journal, were connected to Edward Hoffman's criminal past. The words on the last pages of the journal rang in his head like a warning. This money is cursed. Think twice before you take it. The dusty air of the dungeon squeezed his chest. Harry suddenly realized that he was stuck between two choices. Take the money and change his life, or leave it here, burying it along with the secret of his past. The decision was not easy. Harry had already gotten used to the idea that the house was his second chance at life. But now he wondered, was he ready to pay for this chance at the cost of his conscience? He closed the lid of the chest, exhaled, and went upstairs, leaving the hiding place open. Coming out of the hut, he felt the fresh air hit his face sharply. The trees in the forest seemed to be watching him, condemning his every step. Harry returned home, but the thought of the found chest did not give him peace. The days passed, but his condition only worsened. He spent hours in the living room, looking at the walls, which themselves had become part of this story. One evening, he took out a map with marks and studied it again. Several marks in the area of the house were crossed out, but one remained unresolved. It was located right under the foundation. Harry, despite his fatigue and internal torment, decided to check this too. He went down to the basement, armed with a crowbar and a hammer. Having chosen a place near the wall, he began to dismantle the floor. The work was hard, but after a couple of hours he came across an old metal door set into the concrete. The door looked solid, with a small rotating mechanism. Harry realized he would need a key again. He went back into the hut, took the key that opened the floor, and returned to the door. The mechanism fit perfectly, and soon he was inside a new hiding place. It was the largest of all the hiding places he had found. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with sealed boxes. In the center of the room stood another chest, much larger than the previous ones. Harry opened it and froze. Inside was a huge amount of money. The bills were packed in plastic bags, but unlike the old money he had found in the hut, these looked brand new. Next to the money was a small metal plaque with the words, "For new beginnings. Make the right decision." Harry began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. This money was clearly not just Hoffman's personal savings. It most likely belonged to an entire network, perhaps a criminal organization that Hoffman was connected to. But why had he left it here? Why had he decided to hide it all instead of using it himself? Back upstairs, Harry spent several hours thinking. On the one hand, the money could solve all his problems. He could finish renovating the house, start a new life, leave this backwater town. On the other hand, every time he thought about this money, he remembered Hoffman's note and the words from the diary. This money is not a gift. It brings misfortune. Besides, what if someone was still looking for this money? Perhaps after all these years, people connected to Hoffman were still looking for his hiding places. Harry knew that if he took this money, he could get mixed up in something bigger than just the mystery of the house. He decided to act. The first thing he did was go to the local police station. Harry told them about his find, but without any unnecessary details. He said that he had stumbled upon an old hiding place during renovations and asked the officers to check if the money was on the wanted list. The police were immediately interested in his story. They arrived at the house that same day and confiscated the contents of the hiding place for investigation. Harry watched as the boxes were carried out of the basement. He felt relieved, but also bitter. This was not just money. This was an opportunity that he had given up for the sake of peace. He lived in peace for the next few weeks, but at the same time in tension, expecting the police to return with questions. But their visits stopped. However, one morning, Harry found an envelope lying on the porch. Inside was a note. You made the right choice. Not everyone has the courage to give up something that only brings misfortune. Live in peace. This is your story now. The note was unsigned, and Harry never found out who left it. But from that day on, his life began to change. He finished the renovation, installed the fireplace in the living room that he had always dreamed of, and even improved his relationship with his son, who came to visit him for the summer. The house, which was initially just a project for Harry, became something more. It taught him to make difficult decisions and move on despite temptations. The secrets of Edward Hoffman remained a mystery, but Harry realized that not everything in life needs to be known. Sometimes the main thing is to just make the right choice.